The date is Thursday, October 29, 1914. The Great War, the war to end all wars, rages across Europe and has become a quagmire of trenches dug along hundreds of miles of Central Europe. Artillery barrages sweep from side to side, attempting to drive out the men in those trenches, and victories are measured in inches taken by one side or the other. Always, though, the men return back to their holes, huddling in cold, wet mud as enemy artillery takes revenge for the latest assault. Tens of thousands have already died, and today, fresh recruits move to reinforce the German lines. The men are recently drafted from across Germany's poorer areas, and together make up the 3,000-strong 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. A messenger arrives on horseback bearing critical news. The British have managed to break through German lines, and if they're not stopped, a large part of the front could collapse. The regiment's commanding officer makes a quick decision and barks out orders to his sub-commanders, who blow on whistles to order the men up onto their feet and marching forward at double time. The soldiers hurry the best they can through a forest shattered by artillery barrages and thick with mud, marching to close the gap exploited by the British before a total collapse of this part of the front risks the collapse of Germany's front lines. Through the smoke and fog, though the men of the regiments flanking the Bavarian regiment's march catch only glimpses of gray-green caps, which look from a distance and through a haze a lot like British uniforms. Alarmed, they begin to open fire, unknowingly decimating entire swaths of their own troops. By the time the terrible mistake is realized, the thousands of soldiers are reduced to a few hundred survivors, and in one company, there's only a single man left standing, a 26-year-old soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler. History has well documented the tragedy of Hitler's survival that fateful day, a deed which he repeated numerous times throughout the war, cheating death by incredible margins. Once, he was ordered out of a tent where military awards were being presented, only for an artillery shell to strike the tent and reduce it to a crater, with Hitler just outside it. Another time, a gas attack strikes amongst his line, yet Hitler manages to avoid the worst effects of the gas and is only temporarily blinded. While other survivors of the gas succumb by the thousands to disease and injury, Hitler makes a complete recovery and is once more back on the front lines, where another exploding artillery shell buries shrapnel in his leg, but leaves his body whole and otherwise unharmed. For all intents and purposes, Hitler was invincible, uncannily dodging the wrath of a Grim Reaper who every day claimed thousands. As we look at the world that arose from the ashes of World War II, we're prone to asking how much of the peace of the last 80 years would have existed if Hitler had never driven the world into its last major confrontation. War has not been abolished. 5 minutes on any news program will quickly remind you of that fact. Yet the truth is that war between major powers has not occurred since the end of World War II. And after centuries, millennia even, of incessant conflict between major states and empires, it's hard to believe that without World War II's terrible consequences and the ensuing political order, humanity would have simply given up on its lifelong hobby of killing each other as frequently as possible. The fruits that were fertilized in the ashes of World War II have shaped a new world that would be completely alien to any human being born before the 20th century. A world where major powers pursue diplomacy over war and imperial ambitions are kept in check by a strong alliance of liberal democracies. World War II gave us the United Nations, an agency that rose from the rubble of the League of Nations, and gave it a grim determination to avoid conflict thanks to the League's many failures. Without World War II, the world's first attempt to unify its governments would have failed, and the old order of shifting alliances and constant conflict would have returned. The war also gave us two rival superpowers who held the planet at risk of total annihilation for decades. Yet it's important to note that it was the two specific superpowers who rose to prominence, the United States and the Soviet Union. Two opposing ideologies, democracy versus communism. In a world where violence between communists, federalists, imperialists, and Democrats had raged for decades. In Germany alone, political groups split between the left and the right had been killing themselves for years after the fall of the Kaiser and his empire. And the violence repeated across the whole of Europe as communism found allies and parties of workers oppressed and exploited by runaway capitalism. It's easy for modern observers to be ignorant of the extreme violence between these two ideologies and of the consequence of the two major powers arising from World War II with the means to annihilate each other along with the world, and both radically shifted on opposite ends of the political spectrum. Yet again, it was specifically the United States and the Soviet Union who arose from World War II, two powers who were almost equally matched in every regard. The United States maintained a nuclear advantage while the Soviet Union maintained a conventional power advantage. Both sides found themselves facing the threat of total defeat in any conflict, and thus an equilibrium was achieved, one which actively prevented all-out hostilities on several occasions and rescued the world from Armageddon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without Hitler, it's unlikely that it would have been the evenly matched Soviet Union and the United States who rose to prominence, and this imbalance would almost certainly have led to all-out conflict, either because one side believed itself capable of achieving complete victory through nuclear weapons, or because the weaker side believed it would be forever dominated if it did not strike first with nuclear weapons, while it could still potentially win the conflict. There would have existed a tipping point in history between the two rivals, where the larger power reached a point that if the smaller power did not act immediately, it would never again be able to act to overthrow it. The larger power would have also been aware of this point, would have been aware of its approach, and would have had every incentive to launch a surprise attack on the smaller power first in order to annihilate it. The world would have gone up in nuclear fire. This point existed also between the US and the Soviet Union. Sometime around the mid-1950s, when the Soviet Union began the mass production of atomic weapons and testing on long-range rockets to deliver them intercontinentally. The US was itself greatly behind the Soviets in rocket technology, but had far surpassed them in long-range bombers. If the Soviet Union closed the nuclear gap by developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, it would forever eliminate the US's only nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union. Many within the American military argued for a surprise nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, believing that war was ultimately unavoidable and that this might be the only chance to win it with minimal damage to the United States. Sure, Europe would be reduced to nuclear rubble, but only a few American cities could possibly be hit by Russian long-range bombers, and even this was unlikely. The Soviet Union would be crushed under nuclear rubble, and the world would be free of the threat of a major all-out nuclear war forever, even if it cost the whole of Europe. Thankfully, the American presidents didn't listen to their military commanders, and of course we now understand the consequences of nuclear war far better than we did back then. We know, for instance, that while the United States would have been completely spared any atomic attacks, it and the rest of the world would have been starved to death in the ensuing nuclear winter as trillions of tons of debris shrouded the world for years. We know that global weather patterns would have eventually carried massive plumes of radioactive fallout as far as the American East Coast, potentially making large swaths of the eastern seaboard uninhabitable for decades, perhaps longer. The world would die a cold, dark death, and the survivors would find little land free of the poison of radiation on which to grow their crops once the sun returned a decade or more later. It was Hitler and his rise to power and the war and atrocities he committed that gave pause to the American presidents being compelled to strike out at the Soviet Union. But it was also the fact that their enemy was in fact the Soviet Union, a nation powerful enough to have a level of parity with the United States. Once more, had it not been these two specific nations that rose from World War II, the odds of an uneven matched set of superpowers are almost a certainty. But who could have arisen? Without Hitler, Germany's fate could have taken a threefold path. The constitutional democracy that arose after the fall of the Kaiser was unstable, and the president tried daily to maintain a balance between the opposing political parties. Democratic socialists and full-blown communists made up a large segment of the left seats in the German parliament, and hardline Nazis and imperialist nationalists made up equally large segments in the right seats in parliament. Not only were the two sides opposed to each other, the parties were all completely opposed to one another as well, leaving German democracy so unstable that 2 elections were called for in 1932 alone. This leaves the possibility of 3 paths for Germany without Hitler. Germany could have become a strong liberal democracy, which would have found itself closely allied with the democracies of Britain and France. This would have left the entirety of Western Europe in direct opposition to the expansion of communist Eastern Europe. Without a world war to weaken Germany and draw the United States into European affairs, the US would have remained as it was at the outbreak of World War II, isolationist and content to let Europe fight out its own problems. Hostilities between East and West were all but inevitable, and even during World War II, the British considered for the entirety of the war launching offensives against the Soviet Union after the fall of Germany. Hitler was fully aware of these hostilities, and when he launched his famous counterattack against the Allies pressing into Germany, which resulted in iconic battles such as the Battle of the Bulge, his strategy had in fact been not to completely defeat the British and Americans, but to hand them such a defeat just large enough that they agreed to a ceasefire. After the ceasefire, he hoped to talk the two sides into joining him against the Soviet Union, and was confident enough in this plan to consider it a likely path to a German exit from World War II. With a German liberal democracy, World War II may have been postponed a few years, but would have still taken place, albeit without the United States involving itself. Given Germany's initial lead in developing the nuclear bomb, the West would have used these bombs the moment they became available, devastating the European countryside. With its vast reserves of manpower, though, the Soviets could have held out long enough for their spies to steal the secrets of the bomb and respond with their own in a few years. The devastating nuclear escalation would have led to a global climate catastrophe. Germany, however, could also have become an imperialist state once again. The German president during the early 1930s, Paul von Hindenburg, actually made Hitler chancellor because he expected Hitler to crush his political rivals and place the nation back on the path to imperialism. This historical outcome would very closely match a Germany of a third option, one where Hitler died in World War I and the Nazi Party gave the chancellorship to a much more competent and psychologically stable man. With Germany rising once more as an imperial power or as a fascist state with a more capable version of Hitler, it's indubitable that the nation would have launched the same offensives as it did the days before the official start of World War II. This would have prompted the same response from Britain and France and the same start to World War II. The difference this time, however, would have been a military leader who respected the opinions of his generals, who would not have foolishly launched an attack against the Soviet Union until it had secured Western Europe completely, and who would have practiced war with a more careful and tactfully sound approach. A more capable German Führer, or Kaiser, for example, would not have called for a halt to the German forces on their way to completely crush the British as they tried to flee at Dunkirk. A strategic mistake by Hitler, which would have irrevocably changed the course of the war for the Allies for the worse. Without Hitler and the rise of a capable Führer or Kaiser, Germany would have been an unstoppable war machine, which would have crushed the Allies before the United States could join the fight. Then, Germany could have turned its full might against the Soviet Union, which, facing only roughly half of Germany's power, still suffered near defeat in our real World War II. Facing the full strength of the Wehrmacht alone, the Soviets would have quickly fallen, and the German Empire or Third Reich would lay claim to all of Europe. Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and countless other European nations would exist only as governments in exile inside the United States. A different Cold War would have fallen on the planet, one where the United States faced off across the Atlantic against a Germany far more powerful than itself. Its only choice being nuclear war now or total and complete subjugation forever. The Holy Bible states that God works all things for good, and given the possibilities of a Germany without Hitler, it can be hard to argue that indeed history did turn out for the best despite the horrors of World War II. Millions of lives were lost, yet in the killing, it's likely that billions of lives were saved. And instead of a war of nuclear annihilation or a continuation of the incessant warmongering between major powers, we inherited a world of relative international peace. Our conflicts between major powers limited to small proxy wars in faraway corners of the world, and largely cultural and economic in nature. We never thought we'd say this, but thank God for Hitler? What do you think a world without Hitler would have actually looked like? Also, check out our other video, What if Hitler had won? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.